This is lecture 136 on primitive communism to advance theocratic chiefdoms on the northwest coast of North America. This is the last of the substantive lectures on in support of forthcoming volume 8 on the peoples of North America prior to white contact. And then I'll do one more that wraps up the entire 8-volume series next, and that'll be the end of this lecture series as far as I can see for the moment anyway. So our topic today is the Northwest Coast. The coastal Native Americans arrived by land and sea after 100,000 years ago. Numerous migrations through the British Columbia Trench happened after the Sangamon Interglacial 70,000 years ago. Then more people came by sea to Alaska's southeastern coast by 17,000 years ago. The Tlingit were the most numerous of this group, populating most of the coastal panhandle by the time of European contact. New from the dating of rocks and animal bones, from the dating of rocks and animal bones proves the coast of southeastern Alaska was largely ice-free and full of plant and animal life some 17,000 years ago. Thus, there was a plentiful environment for people venturing south into the New World. Elliot Lesnick, a geologist at the State University of New York in Buffalo, spent the summer of 2015 helicoptering between remote islands off southeastern Alaska, seeking rocks exposed to the sky. Now, such rocks are constantly hit by cosmic rays hurtling down from space. These change individual oxygen-16 atoms in course to beryllium-10 atoms one by one. Now, by measuring the concentration of beryllium-10, researchers can calculate how long the rock has been out in the open. When Lesnick dated the rocks from 4 islands along the coast of southeastern Alaska, she found that the ice covering them had melted away by about 17,000 BP. She then turned her attention to 200 animal bones that had been previously excavated from caves in southeastern Alaska. Lesnick and her colleagues used the latest research to account for the effect of marine diets on radiocarbon. They dated these bones between 45,000 years ago and the present. However, there was a notable gap between about 20,000 and 17,000 years ago, implying that the area was covered in ice during that time, which was not surprising, as this was the period of the Wisconsin maximum glaciation. And travelers moving from south to north could have used the ice-free corridor in Alberta or from north to south. Therefore, the New World was always open during the periods of maximum glaciation. Thus, the northwest coast was open to seafaring migrants for thousands of years before the arrival of Northeast Asian, Northwest American, or Nanamt carriers. The Nanamt people left Kobayashi-type microblades and microblade cores 9,500 years ago at the Tahltan village site, number 2, near Telegraph Creek, and I have discussed this find in several previous chapters and lectures. I now think that these Nanamt carriers came up the Stikine River from Wrangell. At any rate, the Northwest Coast Cultural Area, for our purposes, I define as that part of coastal Alaska and British Columbia, beginning with the Canadian Queen Charlotte Islands and the U.S. Alaskan coast at Yakutat Bay, extending to northern California. The terrain is divided from the interior by the coastal mountain range. The area has a heavy forest cover of firs, spruce, cedar, redwoods, and deciduous trees. Many rivers and streams descend from these coastal mountains to the Pacific Ocean. Rainfall is high, but despite this, the Japanese current keeps the climate quite moderate. The sea and the descending rivers are full of fish. These include salmon, halibut, cod, herring, and candlefish. Prehistorically, mollusks were very important as well, as proven by the numerous shell middens. People hunting sea animals focused on seals, otter, porpoises, and whales. Along the shores, seabirds were plentiful. On nearby land, hunters took deer, elk, mountain goats, bears, and many smaller animal species. The Northwest Coast Cultural Area abounds in food reserves. Thus, the socio-cultural equivalent from primitive communism to advanced theocratic chiefdoms was as certain as the equivalent sociocultural evolution of early agricultural societies in the rest of the world. Now, first, the northern sub-area begins with the Yakutat Bay. It extends southward to the Queen Charlotte Islands. It includes the area inhabited ethnographically by the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian peoples. Swadesh groups these peoples linguistically along with the Athabascan speakers as Nodine. Secondly, the central sub-area is called Wakashan, after that language family. It includes Queen Charlotte Sound and ethnographically included the Kwakiutl, Nootka, and Belakula peoples. 3. Another southern sub-area is named Salish Chinook. It includes the Gulf of Georgia, the southern shores of Vancouver Island, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the Washington coast, and the upper Oregon coast. Ethnographically, the coast Salish, Chinook, and Siuslaw peoples inhabited the area. And 4, there is a southernmost area. It's called Northern Californian, and it extends from the Coquille River in southern Oregon to Cape Mendocino, California. Ethnographically, the Yurok, Karok, and Hupa peoples inhabited this sub-area. Now, taking a look at the mode of production and technology of the hunting and gathering lithic and archaic stages, this focused on fishing and sea mammal hunting. Traps, angling devices, harpoons, and dugout canoes were varied and efficient. The canoes also were important artifacts of travel, given the rugged land areas. Woodworking included the construction of residences of both commoner rectangular plank houses and chiefly architecture. Naturally, the woodworking crafts produced a plethora of household utensils, masks, and eventually totem poles. The carpentry tools included polished bone, antler, and ground and polished stone adzes. The Tlingit consumed halibut, shellfish, and seaweed in the spring, and in the late spring and summer they focused on seal and salmon. Summer was a time for gathering wild and tame berries, such as salmonberry, soapberry, and currants. In the fall, sea otters were hunted. Herring and anadromous candlefish smelt were eaten fresh or dried and stored. Fish provide meat, oil, and eggs. Sea mammals, such as sea lions and sea otters, were used for food and clothing materials. In the forests near their homes, Tlingit hunted deer, bear, mountain goats, and other small mammals. The Tsimshian harvested the abundant sea life, especially salmon, and became a seafaring people like the Haida. Salmon was the center of their nutrition. Using this abundant food source, the Tsimshian economy developed permanent towns. The people lived in very large longhouses made from cedar house posts and panels to withstand the wet climate that housed an entire extended family. Tsimshian translate to, quote, inside the Skeena River, unquote. At one time, the Tsimshian lived on the upper reaches of the Skeena River near present-day Hazelton, British Columbia. The majority of Tsimshian still live in the lower Skeena River watershed near Kitimat, as well as northern coastal British Columbia. There are distinct groups of Tsimshian native peoples: the Nisga'a, the Gitxsan, the Coast Tsimshian, and the Southern Tsimshian. The Southern Tsimshian language was used ceremonially by the Nisga'a and the Gitxsan. According to Southern Tsimshian lore, after a series of disasters befell the people, a chief led a migration away from the cursed land to the coast, where they founded Kitkatla village, the first of 3 southern Tsimshian villages. Kitkatla was the most conservative of the Tsimshian villages. The Nisga'a and Gitxsan remained in the upper Skeena River above the canyon near the Nass River and forks of the Skeena, respectively. Other Tsimshian chiefs moved down the river and occupied all the lands of the lower Skeena Valley. Over time, these groups developed a new dialect of their ancestral language and came to regard themselves as a distinct population. The Tsimshian proper. They continue to share the rights and customs of the Gitxsan, their kin on the upper Skeena. In late prehistoric times, the coastal Tsimshian gradually moved their winter villages to the islands of Ven, Metlakatla. They returned to their some villages along the lower Skeena River when the salmon returned. Archaeological evidence shows 5,000 years of continuous inhabitation in the Prince Rupert region. The Haida people found the Pacific Ocean to be their main source of food. Haida men spent a lot of time fishing in the summers along the coast. In the fall, the salmon would travel up the rivers to spawn, making them easy to catch with nets, harpoons, and traps. They would catch thousands of fish in a small area, and that was enough to feed many families for a year. In addition to the salmon, other foods were halibut, smelt, crab, shellfish, seaweed, and whales. It sometimes took men days to kill a whale. It was dangerous to hunt a whale because they were able to overturn a canoe. Important foods were clams, oysters, and mussels. Before the advanced theocratic chiefdom status, Haida women collected the clams, oysters, and mussels from the ocean, and with the rigid ATC ranking of society, slaves did this work. Now, sledgehammers for splitting wood were made of stone. For hunting, they used bows and arrows, snares, deadfalls, and harpoons. For fishing, they used nets, underwater traps, bone and wood hooks, and harpoons. They also used fish lines made from cedar. Food was served on wooden platters and trays that the women made. Other animals hunted were sea otters, seals, and turtles. The Haida people used a lot of fish oil to add flavor to their food, including the oil from whales, seals, and Uchalan smelt. Uchalan was full of oil, and the women had a special process for squeezing all of the oil from that fish. That oil was a valued trade good, so the majority of pressed oil was saved for trading. Meats and vegetables were baked, steamed, or boiled without the use of pots or pans. Instead, they heated rocks in the fire, then put the hot rocks in a cedar box or basket full of water, which would boil the water and cook the food. The women prepared fish in two ways. Some fish was eaten fresh, but most of it was dried and saved for the winter months. Summers featured Haida men hunting and gathering in nearby forests for black-tailed deer, elk, mountain goat, and bear. Now for the social organizational half of the mode of production, coastal Native American society featured a mix of private and group property. Each household owned tools, objects, and food that they had produced themselves, while the clan owned names, land, stories, buildings, and most other property. The Tlingit coastal system was based on a matrilineal structure with a family of the Crow system of kinship. The society was divided into two distinct moieties, termed Raven and Eagle Wolf. The former identifies with the raven as its primary crest, but the latter was identified with the wolf, the eagle, or some other dominant animal crest, depending on location. Sometimes this moiety was called the Not Raven people. Members of one moiety could only marry a person of the opposite moiety. No word in Tlingit refers to moiety, since referring to a particular person by their clan membership was sufficient to determine their moiety affiliation. The moieties were the primary dividing line across Tlingit society, but identification was rarely made with the moiety. Instead, individuals identified with their matrilineal clan. Clan sizes varied widely, and some clans were found throughout all the Tlingit lands, whereas others were located in one small cluster of villages. The Tlingit clan functioned as the main property owner. Thus, almost all formal property amongst the Tlingit belonged to clans, not to individuals. In the social organization of the Tlingit and Haida, status and prestige were negotiated through wealth. To maintain position, a man of high rank demonstrated wealth by holding a potlatch ceremony in which he would give away, destroy, or invite guests to consume all of his food and possessions. This was referred to as paying off the guests who had performed ritual services or provided support in the past. Those who received goods at one potlatch would typically reciprocate by inviting their former hosts to their own potlatch later. Such invitations would confirm their relative levels of prestige and status. Other important features of the potlatch were the recitation of family histories and bloodlines, transfer of ceremonial titles, possessions, and offerings to ancestors. Most importantly, the potlatch was a dump of social surplus product. It offset the certainty that surplus social product would otherwise become the property of some person or rank, creating social inequality. The mild climate and plentiful resources of the Canadian islands and the Alaskan Panhandle allowed the coastal Native Americans leisure time to devote to social pastimes, travel, and trade. They enjoyed art, music, and storytelling. Their traditions kept an accurate count of genealogy and clan history. The painted designs developed by the Northwest coastal tribes and chiefdoms featured fish, animals, and mythical creatures in patterns of black, red, and other colors. They decorated their craft goods, domestic utensils, clothing and masks, canoes, and ritual objects to signify kin ownership. Now, the ideology of the primitive communists in that stage of the coastal Native American sociocultural evolution believed that fish and animals gave themselves willingly to humans and strove to honor the animal's sacrifice. They also believed that the bones of a consumed salmon should be returned to the river in which it had been caught to allow for reincarnation. Otherwise, the fish would reincarnate with deformities and refuse to return to that river. As primitive communism ended, its animism and animatism transformed into the formal religion of the second intermediary chiefdom stage, which brings us to the advanced theocratic chiefdom totem pole religion. The world-renowned totem poles were carved to illustrate myths, to honor the deceased, and or to imply the enormous wealth of the kinship unit or personal owners. Totem poles illustrate family lineage and the cultural heritage of the Native American peoples in the islands and coastal areas of North America's Pacific Northwest, especially British Columbia in Canada, and coastal areas of Washington and southeastern Alaska in the United States. Families of traditional carvers come from the Haida, Tlingit, Tsimshian, Kwakiutl, Bella Coola, and Nootka, among others. The poles were carved from the highly rot-resistant trunks of giant cedar or western red cedar trees. Totem poles are the largest, but not the only objects that coastal Pacific Northwest natives used to depict spiritual reverence, family legends, sacred beings, and culturally important animals, people, or historical events. The freestanding poles seen by the first European explorers of the region were preceded by a long history of decorative carving. Stylistic features of these poles were borrowed from earlier, smaller prototypes, or from the interior support posts of house beams. Totem poles symbolized the character and events in the religion's mythology, and they conveyed the experiences of recent ancestors and living people. Some of these characters appear as stylistic representation of objects in nature. Others are more realistically carved. Pole carvings may include animals, fish, plants, insects, and humans, and they may represent supernatural beings such as the thunderbird. Some symbolize mythological beings that transform themselves into various forms, appearing as combinations of animals or part animal, part human forms. Consistent use of a specific character over time, with some slight variations in carving style, helped develop similarities among these shared symbols that allowed people to recognize one from another. For example, the raven is symbolized by a long, straight beak, while the eagle's beak is curved, and a beaver is depicted with two large front teeth, a piece of wood held in his front paws, and a paddle-shaped tail. The specific meaning of the designs on totem poles are as varied as the cultures that made them. Some poles celebrate cultural beliefs that may recount familiar legends, clan lineages, or notable events. Animals and other characters carved on the pole are used as symbols to represent characters or events in a story. Some reference the moiety of the pole's owners, or simply fill empty space on the pole. The carved figures interlock, one above the other, to create the overall design, which may rise more than 60 feet high. Smaller carvings may be positioned in vacant spaces, or they may be tucked inside the ears, or hang from the mouths of the pole's larger figures. Some of the figures on the poles constitute symbolic reminders of quarrels, murders, debts, and other unpleasant occurrences. The most widely known tales, like those of the exploits of Raven and of Cats, who married the Bear Woman, are familiar to every native of the area. Carvings which symbolize these tales are sufficiently conventionalized to be readily recognizable even by persons whose lineage did not recount them as their own legendary history. Ethnographic sources have the most important representations on the bottom, bearing the weight of all the other figures, or at eye level with the viewer to heighten their significance. Many poles have no vertical arrangement at all, consisting of a lone figure atop an undecorated column. Because of the climate of the region, the nature of the materials used to make the poles, and the ignorant Christian missionaries who destroyed those they could, few examples carved before 1900 remain. Noteworthy examples, some dating as far back as 1880, include those at the Royal British Columbia Museum in Victoria, the Museum of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and the Canadian Museum of History in Ottawa. There are 6 basic types of totem poles: house frontal poles, interior house posts, mortuary poles, memorial poles, welcome poles, and the ridicule or shame pole. First, the house frontal poles. This type of pole, usually 20 to 40 feet tall, was the most decorative. Its carvings tell the story of the family, clan, or village who owned them. These poles are known as heraldic, crest, or family poles. Poles of this type were placed outside the clan house of the most important village leaders. Often, watchman figures were carved at the top of the pole to protect the pole's owner's family and the village. Another type of house frontal pole is the entrance or doorway pole, attached to the center front of the home, and includes an oval-shaped opening through the base that serves as the entrance to the clan house. Secondly, the interior house posts. These interior poles are typically 7 to 10 feet in height and usually shorter than exterior poles. The interior posts support the roof beam of a clan house and include a large notch at the top where the beam can rest. A clan house may have 2 to 4 or more house posts, depending on the native group who built it. Carvings on these poles, like those of the house frontal poles, were used as a storytelling device for children and helped tell the story of the owner's family history. Thirdly, the mortuary pole. The rarest type of totem pole is a mortuary structure that incorporates grave boxes with carved supporting poles or includes a recessed back to hold the grave box. It is among the tallest and most prominent poles, reaching 50 to 70 feet in height. The Haida and Tlingit people erect mortuary poles at the death of important individuals in the community. These poles may have a single figure carved at the top, which may depict the clan's crest, but carvings usually cover the entire length. Ashes or the body of the deceased person was placed in their upper portion of the pole. Fourth, the memorial pole. Now this type of pole stood in front of a clan house, was erected about a year after a person had died. The clan chief's memorial pole was raised at the center of the village. The purpose of the pole was to honor the deceased person and identify the relative who was taking over as his successor within the clan and the community. The memorial pole had one carved figure at the top, and an additional figure may have been added at the bottom. Memorial poles might commemorate an event. For example, several memorial totem poles were erected by the Tlingits in honor of Abraham Lincoln, one of which was relocated to Saxman, Alaska in 1938. The Lincoln pole at Saxman commemorates the end of hostilities between two rival Tlingit clans and symbolizes the hope for peace and prosperity following the U.S. occupation of the Alaskan Territory. The story begins in 1868 when the U.S. government built a customs house and fort on Tongass Island and left the U.S. revenue cutter Lincoln to patrol the area. After American soldiers at the fort and aboard the Lincoln provided protection to the Tongass group against its rival, the Kagwantans, the Tongass group commissioned the Lincoln pole to commemorate the event. And that brings us to fifth, the welcome pole. Carved by the Kwakiutl and Nootka people, the welcome poles include large carvings of human figures, some as tall as 40 feet. Welcome poles were placed at the edge of a stream or saltwater beach to welcome guests to the community or to intimidate strangers. And finally, we have the shame or ridicule pole. Poles used for public ridicule were called shame poles and were created to embarrass individuals or groups for their unpaid debts and when they did something wrong. These poles were placed in prominent locations and removed after the debt was paid or the wrong corrected. Shame pole carvings represent the person being shamed. One famous shame pole is the Seward pole at the Saxman Totem Park in Saxman, Alaska. It shamed former U.S. Secretary of State William H. Seward for not reciprocating the courtesy or generosity of his Tlingit hosts following a potlatch given in his honor. The figure's red painted nose and ears symbolize Seward's stinginess. Another example of a shame pole is the Three Frogs pole on Chief Shakes Island at Wrangell, Alaska. This pole was erected by Chief Shakes to shame the Kiksadi clan into repaying a debt incurred for the support of 3 Kiksadi women who were allegedly cohabiting with 3 slaves in Shakes' household. When the Kiksadi leaders refused to pay support for the women, Shakes commissioned a pole with carvings of 3 frogs, which represented the crest of the Kiksadi clan. It is not known if that debt was ever repaid. The pole stands next to the Chief Shakes tribal house in Wrangell. The unique crossbar shape of the pole has become popularly associated with the town of Wrangell and continues to be used as part of the masthead of the Wrangell Sentinel newspaper. As of 24 March 2007, a shame pole was erected in Cordova, Alaska, that inverted and distorted the face of former Exxon CEO Lee Raymond for an unpaid debt of $5 billion. That for punitive damages ordered by a federal court in Anchorage, Alaska, for the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Prince William Sound. The Communist Party USA drafted the Indian New Deal Act of the 1930s. It strongly promoted native arts and crafts. In the totem pole, the act identified Northwest Coast art as a thing to be widely appreciated by white society. In Alaska, the Indian Division of the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, restored the old totem poles, copied those beyond repair, and carved new ones. The Indian Arts and Crafts Board, a federal government agency, facilitated their sale to the public. The project was lucrative, but many anthropologists complained that it denied the Native Americans their traditional culture by stripping away the meaning of the totem poles. At any rate, after the tree to be used for the totem pole is selected, it is cut down and moved to the carving site where the bark and outer layer of wood, sapwood, is removed. Next, the side of the tree to be carved is chosen, and the back half of the tree is removed. The center of the log is hollowed to make it lighter and to keep it from cracking. Early tools used to carve totem poles were made of stone, shell, or bone, but beginning in the late 1700s, the use of iron tools made the carving work faster and easier. In the early days, the basic design for figures was painted on the wood to guide the carvers, but today's carvers use paper patterns as outlines for their designs. Carvers use chainsaws to make the rough shapes and cuts, while adzes and chisels are used to chop the wood. Carvers use knives and other woodworking tools to add the details. When the carving is complete, paint was added to enhance the specific detail of the figures. Raising a totem pole was rarely done using modern methods, even for poles installed in modern settings. Most artists use a traditional method followed by a pole raising ceremony. The traditional method calls for a deep trench to be dug. One end of the pole is placed at the bottom of the trench. The other end is supported at an upward angle by a wooden scaffold. Hundreds of strong men haul the pole upright into its footing, while others steady the pole from side ropes and brace it with cross beams. Once the pole is upright, the trench is filled with rocks and dirt. After the raising is completed, the carver, the carver's assistants, and others invited to attend the event perform a celebratory dance next to the pole. A community potlatch celebration may follow the pole raising to commemorate the event. Totem poles did not require maintenance after their installation and the potlatch celebration. The poles usually lasted from 60 to 80 years. Once the wood rots so badly that the pole begins to lean and pose a threat to passers-by, it was either destroyed or pushed over and removed. Older poles typically fell over during the winter storms that battered the coast. The owners of a collapsed pole might order a new one to replace it. Each culture typically has complex rules and customs regarding the designs represented on poles, because the designs were considered the property of a particular clan or family group of traditional carvers. Ownership of the designs could not be transferred to the person who has commissioned the carvings. There have been protests when those who have not been trained in the traditional carving methods, cultural meetings, and protocol have made, quote, fake totem poles, unquote, for what could be considered crass public display and commercial purposes. The misappropriation of coastal Pacific Northwest culture by the art and tourist trinket market has resulted in production of cheap imitations of totem poles executed with little or no knowledge of their complex stylistic conventions or cultural significance. These include imitations made for commercials and even comedic use in venues that serve alcohol and in other settings that are insensitive or outright offensive to the sacred nature of some of the carvings. And a few comments about white contact. The southern portion of Prince of Wales Islands was settled by Haidas emigrating from the Queen Charlotte Islands in Canada. The Tsimshian emigrated during the territorial period from a town near Prince Rupert in British Columbia. The Tlingit were known to travel for more than 1,000 miles south to trade with native peoples in the Pacific Northwest. Trade in the lithic and archaic stages included items of native copper, blankets made of red cedar bark, and dog and coat hair. During the advanced Theocratic Chiefdom stage, slaves were traded. Then Christian missionaries descended upon the territory of the Northwest cultural area and did a great deal of damage. Among other things, they demanded the destruction of the totem poles. By the beginning of the 20th century, they had achieved the outlawing of the religion of these people. It was not until 1938 that a start was made on restoring the rights of the people to the religion and their poles. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act, and then I give its public law numbers, commonly abbreviated to AIRFA, A-I-R-F-A, is a United States federal law enacted by joint resolution of the Congress in 1978. Before the act, law had prohibited many aspects of the various Native American religions. It was enacted to return basic civil liberties and to protect and preserve for Native Americans their inherent right to freedom to believe, express, and exercise their traditional religious rights and cultural practices, especially Native Americans of the Eskimo, Aleut, and Native Hawaiian background. These rights include, but are not limited to, access to sacred sites, freedom to worship through ceremonial and traditional rites, and use and possession of objects considered sacred. The Act required policies of all government agencies to eliminate interference with the free exercise of Native American religion based on the First Amendment and to accommodate access to and use of religious sites to the extent that the use is practicable and is consistent with an agency's essential functions. It also acknowledges the prior violation of that right. And that brings us to a conclusion of this lecture. I'm going to do one more for Volume 8 that's going to summarize all of the previous 8 volumes, go back to the fundamentals of Marxism, Leninism, historical materialism that we started with in Volume 1. And that'll take care of it for today.